Yeah, get some perspective. That's what you say to me, right? All right. So I've been assigned a topic that delights me. I am the son of a coal porter, an antique word that refers to the peddler of religious books. Not only was my father, yeah, we have a word for that. Not only was my father an avid distributor of literature, he was one who thought about the whole enterprise very carefully and who pounded a number of principles about it into my young mind. Not everything I want to share with you tonight came from him, but a lot of it did, and what did not is nevertheless still traceable to him in some way. We are ministers of the Word, and so we believe that in the beginning was the Word. Before there were any quote-unquote platforms, there was the Word. By way of contrast, the soulless and materialistic cosmos that the secularists want to pretend we live in is a place that is just matter in motion, just chemicals jostling around, just time and chance acting on stuff. They believe that these jumbling platforms can somehow generate the Word, as when Ovid had the gods spring forth from the primal chaos. They say, in their naive and quaint way, that in the beginning was the platform, and somehow, don't ask us how, information showed up. Blind chaos, groping, gave us the hummingbird's heart, and all God's people said, yeah, right. Contrary to this, as Christians, we believe that the Word was prior to all platforms, and that any platform that can carry the Word is thereby dignified by it. We also believe that the cosmos is hierarchical, which means that not all platforms are equal. The apostles were very plain that the Word is best communicated when the messenger is breathing the same air as the listener. Acts 20:38, 1 Thessalonians 3:10, 2 John 12. The apostles would much prefer being face-to-face, so Paul says to the Galatians, I wish I could be with you and change my tone. Their distance communication, it can be wonderful, but it's not as good as being there. As we will note later, when that was not possible to be with someone, papyrus and ink would certainly do in a pinch. So, nevertheless, there are natural worries. Platforms for information, platforms that carry information, change and develop over time. Now, at every inflection point, there are always worries. And the worriers are not insane. There are things that can go wrong and frequently do. At every inflection point, certain things are lost, even if the gains outweigh the losses. Plato worried about reducing learning to paper. What would that do to memory? Augustine was astonished when Ambrose read silently to himself in ancient forms laid down to die. Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, and the Reformation became a possibility. Neil Postman worried about typographic man being replaced by men who communicated by means of images on flickering screens. And now we are worried about the next great transition, which would be into the realm of AI. Some of it we shouldn't worry about at all. Some of it we should worry a great deal about, but always within the framework of a biblical worldview. At every one of these transitions, there were people who were concerned, people who were worried, and people who were freaked out. And given what was done with all of these technologies, each in their day, all of the concerned had something of a point. But at the same time, the adapters also had a point. Not all of this is inevitable, but much of it is, and so we need to think through all of these issues carefully. Can the Word, we are ministers of the Word, remember, we are ministers of the Word, can the Word be carried by this platform? Air? Yes. Cuneiform? Yes. Papyrus? Yes. Vellum? Yes. Print media? Yes. Radio? Yes. Television? Yes. Movies? Yes. Blog posts? Yes. Apps? Yes. Podcasts? Yes. Digital translation? Yes. But can these platforms be used to carry lies? Also, yes. Forgeries have been perpetrated by means of papyrus, and deepfake videos are also lies. There are two things we need to hang on to as we navigate these waters. The first is that God looked down upon everything he had made, and he declared it good. The created order is good, and the created order has immense capacities embedded in it, and those capacities embedded in it are embedded in it on purpose. Try to imagine explaining to Aristotle what would one day be done with the silicon in sand. But the second point is that our first parents rebelled against God in this good and plentiful world, and the result has been deep levels of damage. We must look to the scriptures to see how good the created order is, and we must look to the word to remember how busted up it is. So we are to remember creation, good, and fall, wrecked, the crash. I prefer to call the fall the crash. So we are to remember creation and fall, and as ministers of the word, we are to bring the message of redemption. These three: creation, fall, redemption. Now, let's get into some discussion of various technologies. And I'm going to begin by sharing a few scrapes. I'm speaking to you now from notes contained on my iPad. I'm sometimes asked if anything can go wrong. Some people worry about it for me. Can anything ever go wrong? And the answer is yes, it can, and it has. Imagine getting up to deliver a talk and noticing then that the battery didn't recharge. Well, that hasn't happened, but things very next door to that. But I had mishaps back in the good old paper days. Imagine getting up and discovering mid-sermon that pages 2 and 3 didn't print out. There's always something. Then there was a time, this is not technology proper, but it's sort of medical technology. There's the intersection of medical technology and the pulpit. That time that an optometrist talked me into trying soft contact lenses. And it was pretty new. One Sunday when I got to church, I got into this big room, and as soon as I got into this big room, I could tell that something was wrong. And I tried to fix it, and I kept trying to fix it, and by the time I got to the pulpit, I think I had at least one of them inside out, and I couldn't see anything, including the text. I couldn't see the text. I couldn't see anything. All that was left for me to do was to try to preach through the blur. Nancy thought it was pretty good. One time, I was counseling a married couple, and the husband was being difficult. I was urging him to search his heart, but because my phone was sitting there on the table, it was apparently ill-advised for me to use the word search. My phone recorded what I said, autocorrected it erroneously to a vulgarity, and then rebuked me for its misunderstanding. So I'm in the middle of this marriage counseling, serious business, and all of a sudden my phone says, "Your language." Another time, pastoral follies with technology. Another time I was drafting an email to a woman in a church discipline situation. It was a very difficult circumstance, and I was needing to confront her about her lying. It was the kind of situation where you finish the draft, stare at the screen, pray a little prayer with your hand on the monitor, and click send. But when in this instance I clicked send, a pop-up screen appeared with a couple of jalapenos on the screen, maybe 3 jalapenos, I don't remember. And the message said something like, quote, "The average recipient of this email might find the contents offensive." And I think, I'm the pastor. Now, in defense of the programmers, they were probably just trying to protect boozy emails sent to somebody's boss at 2 in the morning. But still, I was the pastor, and here I was just trying to do my job. Was that so wrong? And then, some of you may have seen the recent video clip in which I was speaking in fluent Spanish while learnedly discussing Paedo Communion. It was my voice synced with my mouth and with the unfortunate rendering of Paedo Communion as duck communion. With that one exception, it was also my content. Is this okay? Is this okay? It's spooky, certainly, but is it lawful? And if lawful, is it a good tool to use? So what principles can we use? What aphorisms, what hooks can we hang our thoughts on? So let us begin by remembering that if we are approaching this rightly, we are learning, as my father always taught me, to act, not react. Act, not react. If you are always reacting, the world coming at you will always be terrifying, and you will always be on your heels in a defensive posture. That is not how the Great Commission will be fulfilled, in a defensive crouch. Also, keep in mind that we know next to nothing about the future, and so we are not to make any decisions on the basis of what we know about it. Because God is good, we should expect any number of serendipitous, unintended consequences. Any number of serendipitous, unintended consequences. I believe that many of the movers and shakers in the digital revolution had no idea what they were going to do for Bible study. Right. When I look at what Bible study search programs can do, it is just absolutely astonishing. And who gave us that? Was this an intended consequence or an unintended consequence? So here's some basic thoughts. First, principles, not methods. Principles, not methods. Principles translate from method to method, while methods cannot be translated from method to method by definition. The problem here is that people get hidebound, attached to one particular method. This is how they taught me how to do it. If they can be prevailed upon to move to another method, they retain some of the techniques that worked in the older method, but which don't transfer over readily. I was recently talking with a gentleman in our community, and he indicated that his father had come to email later in life, and had once told his son, the guy I was talking to, that he had forwarded him a particular email message. The son checked and told his dad he had not received it. The father said, "You will," and a bit later he did receive it by means of snail mail. His father had printed it out and mailed it with a stamp. I forwarded you the email. Say that an actor learned his craft with live stage productions, and he had to act in such a way as to convey his emotions to the people in the back row of the auditorium. But imagine if that same actor tried to transfer the same techniques, the same methods, over to television or movies. The results would be quite different because the camera's right on you, as opposed to acting for the back row. This struck me one time. Back in the day, D. James Kennedy was a famous televangelist. He was the kind of televangelist who would preach on television in a robe, Presbyterian church in Florida. But he always seemed to me to be a stiff kind of guy. Pretty formal, stiff, starch, lots of starch. And I was never that impressed. And then one time, many years ago, I had the privilege of speaking at a conference together with him. A church was putting on a conference on education. It was in Kentucky, and it was in a huge sanctuary, and he was a little guy up behind the pulpit there, and I was sitting off to the side, and he was this little tiny, and he was magnificent. I thought, whoa. I was judging this man based on camera method, and he was old school from a different era, and he was doing something that worked in one area, and of course it probably worked in the other because he was on television and I wasn't. But his television presence left me cold because methods and techniques don't necessarily transfer the way principles do. Principles of successful wordsmithing would include things like clarity or balance or striking metaphors. These would be valuable regardless of the form. But the clarity of a long-form essay and the clarity of a proverb express the same principle, but not the same virtues. Same principle, clarity, but not the same virtues. And proverbial expression adapts well to a platform like Twitter. And the gifts that equip a man with proverbs and adages would probably also serve him well in the making of memes. And so don't disparage Twitter or memes, for that matter, because of their brevity. The reason you shouldn't do that is because your criticism would apply equally well to the book of Proverbs. If you say, well, we don't want to reduce everything to little tweets. Well, Solomon did. That's what a proverb is. If an honest answer is like a kiss on the lips, an effective meme can be like a punch in the mouth. Here's an example. If you meet someone whose 6-year-old is transitioning, it is like meeting someone with a vegan cat. We all know who is making the decisions. You read a meme like that, there is no answer. I mean, there you go. One of the principles of war, for example, principles, not methods, one of the principles of war, for example, is mobility. That principle has been fulfilled over the years in warfare by means of chariots, triremes, locomotives, and F-16s. In the realm of spiritual engagement in warfare, technologies can certainly augment a minister's mobility. Charles Spurgeon was able to preach a sermon, have it printed and bound, and have it edifying believers in New Zealand in a matter of mere months. Now, one of Spurgeon's heirs could preach a sermon and have it in New Zealand through a few clicks in a matter of seconds. That's mobility. That's the principle, all right? So that's the first thing, principles, not methods. Always learn to think in terms of principles, not methods. Methods are necessary. You have to clothe every principle in a method, but you shouldn't be married to the method the same way you're married to the principle. Second, compared to what? Compared to what? No technology or app or platform should be evaluated in a vacuum. If a married couple are out on an anniversary date, they should not be sitting in the restaurant texting each other. That is because, pro tip, I've written books on marriage. That is because they are stupidly foregoing the greater blessing for the sake of a lesser blessing. They're sacrificing the wrong thing to the wrong thing. But if he, let's say, if he is deployed with the military and he's across the world, texting her on their anniversary would be a wonderful blessing. Always ask what the alternative is. Right? In the restaurant, what's the alternative? Put the phone down and talk to each other. That's the alternative. But if you're separated by thousands of miles, what's the alternative? Silence. No communication at all. So compared to what? Compared to what? Distance learning. Distance learning is not as good as learning in 3 dimensions, as the apostles made clear through their express preference to be there in person. But it is much to be preferred over distance ignorance. Okay, so you've got distance learning in person and distance learning. If that's the comparison, you learn in person. But if it's distance learning versus distance ignorance, then the choice is completely different. The book of Romans is distance learning. And so we ought not to sneer at distance learning. It would have been a great blessing to have learned these great truths from the apostle himself, but as he was going to die sometime, it was a wonderful thing that he put his thoughts down in one language with various pieces of paper, carrying those thoughts, the paper was the platform, carrying those thoughts through the course of centuries with other scholars, then extracting those thoughts from different pieces of paper and translating them into English for me. That is quite a bit of distance. And when I learn something in the book of Romans, it's distance learning. Nobody wants people attending church on their laptop as a simple matter of convenience. You know, it's just a matter of time before somebody has a cyber church where if you want to partake of the sacrament, you just go buy your roll from the Starbucks barista, and then you just need to click the little bread icon. Right? Now you've taken the Lord's Supper. That would be appalling for the same reason that a couple texting at the restaurant is appalling. But what if you were in a house church in a country where worship was illegal? Would it be sinful to sing and pray together, watch a sermon on YouTube, and then have communion? What is the alternative? Compared to what? All right, what are we talking about? Number 3, optimistic suspicion or suspicious optimism. As mentioned earlier, the created world is good. Because of our rebellion in this fallen world, we must deal with our bent towards sin. But we have a tendency to locate sin in the stuff, as though alcohol were the problem and not a lack of self-control. But there is no sin in the alcohol. There is no sin in the silicon. There is sin in our hearts, and there is sin in our hearts whether we are sinning through drunkenness or sinning through fastidious, legalistic abstinence. So we should be optimistic because God placed us in a fruitful world. We should be a bit cynical because we have rebelled against God and we are always looking for ways to justify our sin. But we must not be cynical about the goodness of the created world. The thing we should doubt would be ourselves. Doubt your hearts. Search your hearts. Turn Siri off and search your hearts. One place where a lot more sunny cynicism would be in order would be during those times when we've not yet developed the cultural mores that accompany a new technology. I remember learning telephone etiquette as a young boy. I mean, really. This was the era when phones were used for making what used to be called phone calls, and the phone was attached by a wire to a wall in the house. Then, as I recall, we got fancy and somebody started putting buttons on those things. At any rate, when you called somebody, you were to let it ring 6 times. And then, I still know this, right? Let it ring 6 times, and then you should hang up. And when you answered the phone, you would say, Wilson's, Douglas speaking. You were not supposed to say, Yankee Stadium, third base. As things change, we develop other forms of etiquette. But the technology has to be there for a while. All right, we develop email etiquette and texting etiquette and so on. But in the Wild West days of each new platform, a lot of people revert to a state of Hobbesian nature where everything is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. They do things with the new technology that they wouldn't dream of doing with any older form. Some of the people misbehaving in YouTube comment threads are possibly very polite in person. But then you get online and something happens. Why? Well, the etiquette, the cultural mores have not caught up with everybody yet. Next, zero-sum thinking. One of the deadliest errors we have fallen into is the universalization of zero-sum thinking. This is true in very limited areas. If you are dividing a pie between 8 people, it is quite true that a huge piece of pie for one of the 8 means a smaller piece for the other 7. That's true. 3 guys interested in the same girl, that's a zero-sum situation also. But out in the wide world, in the world we are talking about, the world of ministry opportunity, the pie is constantly growing. The great opportunities that are created do not usually eliminate opportunities for others, quite the reverse. The pie grows. Would you rather have 8% of a huge pie or 25% of a tiny pie? Right? What are the ratios? As George Gilder points out in Life After Capitalism, a fantastic book, the digital revolution is riding on the back of 3 platform elements: silicon, oxygen, and aluminum, the 3 most plentiful elements in the Earth's crust. We serve the God of 30, 60, and 100-fold. The deadly belief at the center of zero-sum thinking is the deep fear that God is stingy and tight-fisted, or, if you're a secularist, the idea that our heartless cosmos is stingy and cruel. But remember what I said about the fall. We are the ones who are heartless and cruel. We are that way, and so we love to project. And in projecting our fears, we are revealing what things would be like if we ran the show. Our jitters and fears about weather, about the economy, about climate change, about technological jim jams, are often created by our illusions concerning our own omnicompetence. But we are not omnicompetent, and we have no right to be overwhelmed. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. In the meantime, do not assume that we are somehow at risk because we must entrust our future to God. God is our Heavenly Father, and we are called to trust Him. Moreover, it is not irrational to trust Him. In fact, it is irrational not to. He did not create a zero-sum world. And in those few places where there are zero-sum spaces, it is because God wanted to bless us with particular blessings, e.g. a specific spouse and legitimate children with particular names that you gave them. But in most areas, we are reminded of how the Lord gave the entire planet to one human couple, telling them to exercise dominion. There is, in other words, a lot of blue sky above us. The cultural mandate was repeated again at the time of Noah, after the fall, and after a stupefying judgment on global sin. And if we compare the Great Commission, Psalm 8, and Hebrews 2, we can say together with the apostle, we do not see all things put under him. We do not see dominion yet, but we see Jesus, Hebrews 2, 8 and 9, and not a zero-sum Jesus either. And so, we need to bring all of this back to the Word. The central message is always, of course, Christ and Him crucified. That is our pole star. What is light? In the beginning, we see that light was the Word speaking. God said, "Let there be light." And there it was. That's what He spoke. What are the heavens and earth? Again, the Word speaking. What are all the mountains, lakes, trees, and prairies? The Word speaking. Whenever a new opportunity presents itself, a new platform, a new method of communicating, two questions should present themselves. The first is whether or not Christ can be proclaimed by this means. The second is whether or not this method, if adopted and utilized, would tend to take away or rob or compete with some of the older, more established means of communicating the Word, particularly with regard to preaching in the context of incarnate worship. We don't want to do anything that takes away from the assigned platforms, but if we're not doing that, if we're careful not to do that, then we want to extend the ministry of the Word into every lawful platform. And if there's any real question about any of this, then we should look where Christ Himself taught us to look. Is the orchard fruitful? So, well, look to the fruit. Thank you.